Now, the weight of that world is on them. Let them fix it. Because if they don't, will people suffer? You're damn right they will. But will there be consequences? Oh, yes. And so I think between the governor and the majority on the House side, they need to come up with a plan to do something. Otherwise, education could really bite them, given that this is an election year. And for once, the minority should get out of the way.
Yeah,
Don't try to save everybody all the time. Sometimes, if the herd's going to go over the cliff, maybe that's what needs to happen.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is former Kotzebue Representative Reggie Joule. He is listed in the Alaska Sports Hall of Fame as the greatest practitioner of the blanket toss in the long history of the World Eskimo Indian Olympics. And his skill in that Alaska Native sport led to his appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson twice. He attempted to cash in on his athletic fame when he ran for the Alaska State House the first time in 1988, but lost. 10 years later, he ran and won. We discuss a lot in this episode, but front and center is the need for purpose in our lives. Reggie Joule found his purpose several times, and I am so grateful that we had this conversation.
Reggie Joule, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Where were you born?
I was born in Nome to Vera and Alfred Huff. And at that point, I was the youngest of four. But because my mother named me after her recently deceased older brother, Reggie, my grandparents took me without the permission of my parents. And my grandfather was a school teacher, and he was teaching in St. Michael's at the time. He took me to St. Michael's, they took me to St. Michael's, and then they took me to Fairbanks, legally adopted me, changed my name to Joule.
Which was their last name?
Yes.
You said without your parents' permission, and you said it was because your mother named you after your recently deceased
Uncle.
Was that just the cultural norm that...
The way I describe it to my children, I put it this way. At that time, grandparents were the law. There weren't courts, very many courts. And oftentimes, the grandparents would normally take the first of the children. But because I had the name of my uncle, who died 5 months before I was born, they took me and then raised me as their own.
It was a typical cultural thing for grandparents to raise the oldest grandchild?
Generally, yes. And I was fortunate in that because a couple of years after I was born, my parents split up. My older siblings were raised in a children's home in Homer. And when my mother went back to pick them up, the state would not give them back to her. She was a single mom, and she was Native, and
this was like the late 50s?
Yes. Yeah.
And so they deemed her not an appropriate parent.
More than likely, I wasn't there, but yeah.
So you feel like you lucked out in a way because you were in a stable home with...
I had my grandparents. I had a mother and a father that I called them my parents. Yeah.
And did you have a good relationship with your grandparents that you called your parents?
Oh, yeah. My grandfather was originally from Point Hope. I think my grandma or my mom was born there and later moved to Point Lay, but she always considered herself from Point Lay. And so I had this, in the 50s, to be raised by your grandparents who were from a whole different era was a blessing to me. It gave me the kind of grounding and understanding my family tree stuff a lot, and my heritage.
Because were they
I
born like in,
My dad was born in 1901. I call him my dad.
yeah, in 1901?
Right.
Mhm.
He went to school in Massachusetts. He was a Inupiat man. The Episcopal Church took him and sent him out to school in Massachusetts. And then he became a teacher. And he was one of the early Inupiat teachers. My mom was a nurse and a cook, and so she tended to the health of the students in the school as well as making sure they were fed. And that was the environment that I was raised in. Oddly enough, though, Dad was a teacher at the territorial school, which later became BIA, and speaking the language,
Did you
language.
speak a new?
No.
You didn't speak Inupiat.
They raised me to speak English. And I could understand it at one point, but when we moved to Kotzebue in 1959, I lost it there because most of the other children my age were speaking English because the ones that were older than me were actively, how do I say this? Actively discouraged from speaking Inupiat. They were punished.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of my age group grew up speaking English.
Did you have a relationship with your mother, with your birth mother?
Later, I did. Yes. She was a fine lady.
And your older siblings, when your mom went to pick them up and she wasn't able to get them, did they end up staying in the children's home?
They stayed and grew up in Homer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And did you have a relationship with them?
I met my oldest, or the brother just older than me, when I was 17. I met my sister when I was 14 or 15 when I was going to Copper Valley School, which was a Catholic boarding school over by Glen Allen. Mm-hmm. And I met the older brother when I was 20 in, of all places, Orange County.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are they still alive?
They are.
Yeah. Do you have a relationship with them now?
Oh, yeah. I talk to them quite often. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how did you end up at the Copper Valley School?
I mentioned that my grandfather was sent out to Massachusetts to go to school. I had some friends that I spent a lot of time with who were non-native in Kotzebue, and their children went to Copper Valley School. And they were owners of a little mom and pop store in Kotzebue. And when their children went off to school, I was over there constantly helping out the folks and doing whatever. And Joe Walsh, I don't know if Tristan, who works.
Yes, I do.
Tristan Walsh is staff for Representative Jenny Armstrong of West Anchorage.
Tristan's grandfather
was in Kotzebue. I thought he was in Nome.
No, he was in Kotzebue. He was born in Nome.
Interesting.
Anyway, Tristan's grandfather went over and visited my dad, and to see if he would object if I went to Catholic school. Mm-hmm. And because my dad had gone out to school, and he had been already pondering that, so he readily agreed. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Copper Valley School for my sophomore, junior, and senior year.
And so were you raised Episcopal and then sent to a Catholic school? Was that kind of how that worked? Or?
Yeah.
Gotcha. And I didn't ask, your birth father, did you have a relationship with him?
No, I never. I'm sure we were around each other when I was an infant, but I don't remember any of that. No.
And you don't know what happened to him?
He died in Chicago. He had another son, so we have a half-brother up there. But he was a veteran, and when he passed away, he was laid to rest in the Milwaukee Cemetery in an area that was reserved for veterans.
Mm-hmm. Have you visited his grave?
Yes. Actually, I happened to be in Wisconsin, up in Green Bay, and my sister was working for Child Services for the state of Washington, and she went to Green Bay on a Indian child welfare issue. And we met there, and she told me that she had found out where he was laid to rest, and so we drove down to Milwaukee and was able to find his gravesite actually quite easily.
And his last name was Huff?
Huff, yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience like at Copper Valley High School?
it was a wonderful experience. It was one of the best that I had. I was active in sports. I was active in student government. I was active in some of the clubs that we had. And I was an okay student and played basketball.
Yeah, well, I was told that a very good basketball player in high school.
I never thought I was. I know I was really fast.
Mm.
I always fancied myself as being fairly good on defense, not that great on offense, but I could run. I ran track and field and I ran cross country.
I know you graduated from high school in 1970. I also know that was for the Arctic Winter Games. I mean, you're famous for the blanket toss. Correct. I guess I want to talk about that. Can you talk about how you got involved in
Native sports.
Yes.
Indigenous sports. Growing up in Kotzebue, our house was an old schoolhouse that was for the non-native kids.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got to Kotzebue, that became teacher housing for Dad, who was a teacher. And it was right in the middle of where all the community activities for the 4th of July took place. We had foot races, they had a whole bunch of things, but they also had the Eskimo dancing and some of the native games, including the blanket toss. And I watched the native games quite carefully because I was pretty active.
Mm-hmm.
And the blanket toss, gosh, watch that. And one summer in the summer school, and I must have been about 10 or so, we took a tumbling class as part of a summer school. And so they were having the blanket toss, and I decided to get on. And I maybe weighed 50, 60 pounds. I was a skinny, scrawny little thing. And the people who handled the skin were these hunters who were big, strong people. And gosh, they threw me up, and when I first went up, I drifted. And when I looked down, I could see all these faces looking up at me, and the skin was way over here. And I was going to land on people, and the people were so packed around the skin that the guys holding the skin couldn't come underneath me to catch me. And so the first thing that came into my mind when I looked down again, and this all happened so fast, was there was nobody there except one man. And his arms were like this. And I thought, soon as my toes touch the ground, I'm going to roll.
Mm-hmm.
And then I never touched the ground. This guy actually caught me with my arms. And he set me down. And I remember looking up at this big man. And I said, thank you. And he was a non-native and actually was the new Catholic priest.
Oh, wow.
Up in Kotzebue. So at that point, after I thanked him, I turned away and I walked directly away from him, not realizing that right behind me, the pullers of the skin had laid the skin on the ground. And I ended up walking right back onto the skin. And they picked it up and started throwing me again. And that was my first experience. And there was some wonderful older gentlemen, and some of the women, they were incredibly graceful. And some of them were quite acrobatic. They could do backflips. The women and one of the guys were really graceful, and it was like, I can do that. And so later on, I started doing the blanket toss. And when I won the competition at home, and I won, I think, the 1 or 2 foot high kick or both of those events, the Chamber of Commerce in Kotzebue sent the winners to Fairbanks to the World Eskimo Indian Olympics. So my first experience at the Eskimo Indian Olympics in Fairbanks was in 1970. And I really didn't do much of anything. But after that, I think of the 15 or 16 years that I competed in Fairbanks, I think I won the blanket toss like 10 times.
Yeah, I see that you have 10 gold medals.
And won the high kicks or took first, second, or third for a number of years. And then one year they announced that they were going to take four of us, four people, to the Tonight Show in Los Angeles. And I think that happened in 1973. And I did fairly well that year, along with Lester Bodfish from Wainwright, Roger Kuniak from Little Diamond, Freddie Titus from Minto, and Laura Burke was our spokesperson. And so we went down on the Tonight Show, and she explained to Johnny what we were doing, and then we demonstrated the games. She presented him with an usuk, a walrus usuk, and he picked it up and he thought, oh, this is really nice. And he was handling, stroking, doing whatever. And then he says, what is this? And she told him it's a reproductive organ of a male walrus. Of course, he dropped that right on his table. And that was really funny. And then she proceeded to read the Ode of the Usuk to him. And it was hilarious. That went over well. And then I went back on by myself 10 years later and appeared again on the Tonight Show because we were promoting at that point a documentary on the World Eskimo Indian Olympics that was going to be showing a few months later. And so we did that second tour in the Tonight Show, I think in 1983, and then the Today Show with Brian Gumbel in 1983 in New York City.
I'll just read that you're in the Alaska Sports Hall of Fame as, quote, the greatest practitioner of the blanket toss in the long history of the World Eskimo Indian Olympics. That's a big honor.
Yeah. For me to keep that into perspective, I was a tour guide in Kotzebue when I was going to college. And in the summer months is when the World Eskimo Indian Olympics would go on. There was an older man who did the Eskimo dancing and stuff and did some explanation of what the cultural things that we were doing. And he told me he needed to talk to me, and he pulled me outside one day while the tourists were inside. And he said when he was a boy, he would go down to the hall during the Christmas games. And he said one year, this gentleman grabbed the box underneath the stove that had soot from it because they were burning coal. And he took the box of soot to the middle of the floor. Then he put his mucklucks on because he didn't have tennis shoes, right? And he told the people in the gathering that this was going to be the last time he was going to do the high kick. And he stood there and without running, without any kind of approach, but from a standstill, he jumped up and he placed both of his feet on the ceiling of that building, an 8-foot ceiling. And then he said that he was not going to kick anymore. And he left the marks there. And I was just flabbergasted because we were starting to approach 7 feet on the 2 foot. We're doing okay on the 1 foot. And he further explained to me that the man's name was Walter Lincoln. And then at the time that he did that, he was 57 years old. And he never once cautioned me about being boastful. And there was no way that I could be after that story. That really was a lifelong lesson. I realized that as good as I thought I was, we weren't even close to what our predecessors were able to accomplish throughout their lives. Because the struggle for life was every day, constant. And you had to be ready to meet those challenges. And you had to be fit in order to do that.
When was the last time you were blanket tossed?
Probably about 3 years ago. It's been a long time since I've been in competition, but on the skin, just for fun.
So you were like 68 or 69 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you were exposed to it in Kotzebue, but did your mother or father do it?
I was told when I went up to Point Hope for a whaling festival that when I got on and people watched me jump, then I was told that my grandmother on my mother's side was very good on the blanket toss skin. And so when I was on there, apparently I reminded them of her because in Point Hope, they understand the lineage very well. And 4 out of the 5 children that we have are all pretty good on the skin. That was fun.
You talked about the very first time you were on the blanket of you drifting and the priest catching you. Did you ever suffer any injuries? Did you ever during your... Yeah.
I broke my leg in 1976 doing the blanket toss.
What happened?
I drifted. People didn't move quick enough. I was way up there. And so they didn't have time to come around and get me in when I landed at the end of the edge of the skin, but they were moving. And so when I hit that and they were moving, it snapped my leg, but it also pitched me right out of the skin. And I didn't, to my recollection, I didn't even touch the people who were holding the skin. I just went right over them. And the back of my head was just about ready to get cracked open from the floor. And there was one guy who was keeping the crowd away. And he just happened to be there, and he reached underneath my head and shoulders and just cradled that part and broke my fall. And I looked at him, and he's one of my cousins. And I told him, "Oh, Khan, my leg is broken." They took me to the hospital and ambulance and did all that stuff. But yeah, that was in 1976.
Were you afraid to get back on the skin after?
Oh, hell no.
No? You're back on.
No, actually, in 1976, a group of us went back to Washington, D.C. for the bicentennial, but we went in August. The celebration was later. And we did the blanket toss down there. And I was in my walking cast, and I was doing the blanket toss.
Wow.
So, no, I didn't let that little inconvenience stop me.
That's so interesting. So after you graduated from high school, you went to University of Alaska for a couple of years.
Yeah. I met my wife there.
And Fairbanks.
In Fairbanks. And in 1972, I was trying to find a job in Anchorage. Couldn't find a job in Anchorage. Linda went to Bethel. That's where she's from. And she wrote to me and said there was a couple of job openings in Bethel. One was as a janitor for Wayne, which was an airline, and the other was as a jailer. So I borrowed $60 from my sister, which was enough for a one-way ticket. I went to Bethel, got off the plane, flew in out of Wayne's, got off the plane, filled out the application there. And the next day I went to the city and filled out the application for the jailer. Didn't know a soul other than Linda. Hadn't met her siblings yet. Got a job 2 days later working for Wayne. And we were there for a few months before we moved back to Kotzebue, my place. And I worked as a planter trainee for a new organization then called Manila, which was a nonprofit. And did that for years. Then I went to work for Wayne again after a year of doing that office work. And I worked for Wayne for 8 years. Then later, I worked at a culture camp about 35 miles out of Kotzebue, a place called Siwanilvik. And the purpose of that camp was to teach our kids, the young campers, the Inupiat values, the human values. The ones that we hear about, the cultural values today. And I did that for 5 years. And that was probably one of the really pivotal points in my life, because I didn't know a darn thing about being in camp. I didn't know too much about hunting. And I certainly didn't know a whole lot about being around a lot of kids. And yet I was asked to coordinate this camp. And so I spent a lot of my time with the elders that we had then. And for 5 years, they were my mentors.
Well, your parents, who were your grandparents,
Right.
right? So they didn't teach you subsistence because
I remember going hunting with Dad, but because they were my grandparents, when I started to become of age, they were already getting older. That didn't work out too well for me that way.
Mhm.
Well, after I got married and we moved home, my friends who I worked at the airline with started to take me out hunting because they said, you're going to be raising a family, so you have to learn how to provide for them. So my friends who were older than I was took me under their wing.
And you didn't have any shame about not knowing how?
No, I didn't. I don't think I was smart enough to be ashamed.
Mhm.
I just did it.
Yeah.
I didn't know any better. I was that uneducated, if you will. And it was real interesting because here are these guys, they take me out. They knew the country very well, and I began to learn. And when we were fortunate to get animals and all of that, it was hands-on. Everything was hands-on. And I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but you can't taste a mistake when you're field dressing, you know? Especially if you take good care of the animal. If you pop a gut, so what? You wash it out and it stinks like hell, but as long as you didn't get any on it, you clean it out. You're not going to taste it up against the rim cage and the diaphragm. Just do a better job of cleaning it up. But you'll learn how to do things properly. You'll learn how to be respectful, not only of the fish or the game that you're in, you learn to be respectful of the land as you're on it. And they taught me all of these things and sharing and hard work and having a good time. This concept of spirituality, I had no idea. And I never heard those words until the mid-'80s. And I was doing that culture camp with those indigenous values that we were teaching the kids. I realized that the people who were teaching me taught me a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been lucky in my life to have the right kind of people and be willing to learn. And it really is harder to learn how to hunt and live off the land as an adult than when that's what you grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
And as a young father, I tried to make sure that the kids learned all of that as part of their growth.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, I've noticed that they're a lot closer to the land than I am.
Where do your kids live now?
Anchorage, Kotzebue.
You ran for office the first time in 96?
Actually, I ran for office the first time in 88.
88.
And got my butt kicked.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Why did you decide to run in 88? What led you to do it?
Al Adams was moving from the House to the Senate. And I had some recognition because of my involvement in the World Eskimo Indian Olympics. I thought I could do a good job. I had all of this stuff that I did with the culture camps. So I knew a lot of the parents. I did a lot of traveling to the villages, and had some good exposure. And I thought I could win. What I didn't realize at the time was I was not ready to win. And I really wasn't. And so losing was quite humbling for me. Because I don't know that I lost much of anything. Any foot race, any competition or anything.
You always won. You were the winner.
And to lose something that you really wanted was that rocked my world a lot. And I never thought about running again. I always thought I might. I was a clear blue. Then in 96, I ran again. But at that point, I was ready to win.
And did What happened in 96? Was it an open seat or did you run against the incumbent?
Actually, there was an appointed incumbent,
Okay.
and I ran against him. And by that time, one of the things I learned when I lost was how to win. And it starts with believing that you can. And not making any promises that you couldn't keep, so I made two. I promised that I would work hard. And I promised that I wouldn't make my home someplace else and just use it as a mailing address so I could continue to be registered there. Those were the two promises I made.
And you still have your home in Kotzebue?
Oh, yeah. I have a home in Kotzebue. I also have a home in Wasilla now, but we haven't changed our residence. But I'm not running for office.
Yeah, you can live wherever you want.
Yep.
But when you were in office, you kept your mailing address was your home address, which was in Kotzebue.
Yep. And actually for quite a few years after I was done. Because I went on to be the borough mayor and then started working as a lobbyist.
Do you remember your first year in office?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
It was like climbing Mount McKinley with no ropes, no safety gear. And when you're from rural areas, there's not too many people that you can rely on. I had the best mentor that I could have possibly have had in Al Adams, who was my senator. And I'd known him for a lot of years. And he took me under his wing. And it was extremely difficult. Reading legalese is not an easy thing to do. And I was fortunate. I had a fellow by the name of Tom Panamaroff, who was my aide. And I would take legislation home and read it as part of work that I was doing on certain committees. And then I'd come back in the next day to make sure that I read the intent of it, because it was so difficult to figure out what the hell it was trying to do. And he would correct me and tell me the legalese and all of that stuff, and showed me how to reference the statutes and all of that. I would practice every night. And every day when I was doing my homework, preparing for the committees that I was on then, which was resources and community and regional affairs, and there was another one, I can't remember which. So I was constantly busy, but I would have the gavel to gavel on. Mm-hmm. I'd be reading stuff, but I'd be watching, because what gavel to gavel covered was all the other committees and places that I wasn't. Mm-hmm. So I got to get a better sense of what was going around in the building than just in the committees that I served. And for those of us from the rural areas, we really had to do that. And they still do, because there aren't as many of us to pick up the slack someplace else. A lot of us learn early that the legislative session is really a multi-layered chessboard. And at one level is the House. The next level is the Senate, and they each have their own dynamics. And then you got to add the governor. Then you got to add the last 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. Because everything at that point doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't have to. Mm-hmm. And it was a crazy learning experience. And I didn't drink alcohol at all. And I haven't since the mid-'80s. But I would go down to the bars on a Tuesday night. Mondays and Tuesdays were the quietest nights. And I would get the proverbial bar napkin, and I would, I knew some of the things that I had to focus on during the session. And I would write them out and diagram how I needed to get there. And I would do that once a month and see how I progressed. Because by the time you're a month out, everything has got to be in the final stages of being in position, already in the budget, it has to be positioned, and the committees, you've got to be through the committees.
Were you doing that from the very beginning?
I learned to do it after the first session.
I was going to say, because when I'm hearing that now, I'm like, it's a little late for me, but I've learned this the hard way that, at this stage, April, in the second year, there's a lot of things that I wish I'd done a couple months ago.
Yep. Yep. And the one thing that even today, because I'm still a little familiar with the process, even at the beginning of the session, you can figure what's going to be the big stuff at the end of the session. Mm-hmm. And that's what you prepare for. Mm-hmm. So you keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And like I said, in the last 3 weeks, it really doesn't matter because none of it has to make sense. It just happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I moved to Alaska in 1998. I didn't pay attention to anything to do with politics. So I'm very sympathetic to folks who don't follow this because for so many years I didn't follow it.
And one of the things you learn about Alaska, you can be as far away or as close as you want to Alaska politics. Mm-hmm. And if you're a caring person, you're going to run into it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's unavoidable.
So for me, I think of the Bush Caucus as the Bush Caucus we have now of 4 people. Having interviewed a lot of people, I know that the Bush Caucus has been much bigger and that it has morphed over time and meant different things. Can you talk about being part of the Bush Caucus and what it was like when you started? And
when I came in, my first session in 1997, after the 96 election, I'm not sure who the Bush Caucus chair was, but Richard Foster was one of the longer-serving House members, Neil's dad. And he said, "You're going to be the Bush Caucus chair." And that was the end of that discussion. I got drafted. Richard Foster and Ivan were in the majority. And there was myself and Irene Nikolai. Whereas the other 2, and she and I were in the minority. All 4 of us were Democrats.
But Foster and Ivan were caucusing with the Republicans. And that's interesting because, again, for me in this perspective, it's like, oh, the Bush Caucus moves as a group from one side or the other. But that's not always true.
No. All of us were part of the Bush Caucus. And boy, we had some disagreements. And we, as a minority, we'd throw rocks at the budgets at the end of session because that was our job, right? And we would try to put Richard and Ivan in an awkward position, which in hindsight was really stupid. It really was. But we would come together on any of the issues that were rural focused. And that there was just no question. But I learned some valuable lessons from Ivan and Richard in my time here. Richard was strategically located fixture in finance. Ivan was the chair of the Community and Regional Affairs Committee, and there was an issue, and I sat on that. And I happened to be in his office. He was explaining to me a local boundary commission issue and how the votes needed to go. He had a plan, and I sit there and yeah, okay. And then we got into the meeting, and then when it came time to vote, I voted, but I didn't vote the way he wanted. And after it was all over with, he asked me to his office. And he said, it's real important here that when you give your word, that you don't break it. I said, okay. He said, but understand why you voted the way you did. And in the end, that was the right thing to do. He said, but the only reason I'm bringing you in here to have this discussion is when I was telling you and you were shaking your head and saying, okay, what you were saying is, okay, you're speaking. Okay, I hear you. And all the while you weren't agreeing. You were doing a very native thing because that's how we are. And I had to learn this lesson. When you say okay, Yeah, and you shake your head, nod your head. Down here, that means you're giving your word. And your word's all you have here. So take that for what it's worth. And that was a wake-up call to me. Because he was exactly right. A lot of times we'll sit there and somebody's talking and we'll be nodding our head. Yeah, we're acknowledging that you speak. Not that we agree, but that you're the one speaking. And so he handled me with kid gloves. And that was one of the best lessons that I could have learned down here. And I was very careful after that. And later on, the Bush Caucus kind of became a coastal caucus because we had people from Southeast, we had Kodiak, we had Homer, I think. And
Well, how do you decide? How do you decide when to add people to the Bush Caucus?
It was just mutually decided by the four. We agreed, and then it just shrank back to the four, 4 or 5, and reapportionment. And now there's really 5, right? You've got, because we've lost seats, but we're able to get. You're still able to get somebody elected from Bethel. You're still able to get somebody from the north, from the southwest. You have Mike Crunk.
I don't want to speak out of turn. Mike Crunk wants to be in the Bush Caucus.
And this is just me. I think he should be. He serves a large district, one of the largest districts. And he should be, in my opinion. But that's not there are other people who make those decisions here.
So when you started, the Bush Caucus was split, and 2 were in the minority and 2 were in the majority. In 2008, you went with the Bush Caucus to caucus with the Republican majority.
With all but one.
All but one.
Yeah.
Oh, Mary Patola?
No. Mary had already moved on, and Bob Heron was here. Bryce Edgman was here, and myself. It was Woody Salmon from the interior that chose not to move over with us. I think he really wanted to, but he was a very traditional man. And he was also a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. Not that we weren't, but he just couldn't see it for his district, and he chose not to. And he reconsidered one time and asked me to set up a meeting with the speaker then, Mike Chenault, and I did, and then he backed out again. And so I knew he really wanted to, but I don't know that he could reconcile with himself that he could have done it. It was not an easy decision for us to do, and I know we burnt some bridges when we made that decision. And eventually, I think those things healed over.
You burned bridges with the Democrats that you left behind?
Yeah. And mostly at that point, it was the minority leader and the whip, or 2 people. And I had been telling them all along that I was considering it, but I don't think they believed I'd pulled the trigger. And it turned out to be a good thing for rural Alaska. They already had Richard Foster in that caucus. Carl Morgan was later. When I think about Richard Foster and Ivan, or Richard Foster and Carl Morgan, who was from Antioch, they were in the majority. They never received the kind of credit that they deserved for warding off a lot of harmful stuff that was coming rural Alaska's way.
So by being in the room with the majority, they were able to steer the majority away from some bad stuff.
Yeah. Not always from the Senate side. The Senate was a whole different animal, but on the House side. And I don't think that Richard Foster and Ivan and Carl Morgan ever received the credit that they were due for how they were able to control the damage headed out in rural Alaska.
Did you get any negative feedback?
No.
Nope.
Nope. They asked why, but I was already on finance, and I stayed on finance. One of the things in the minority that we did constantly at the end of the budget, or when we were doing the budget, was as power cost equalization. The stuff was always out there. It was never fully funded. It was only partially funded. And things like LIHEAP and other things were surely underfunded. When we got in the majority of those things were fully funded, and we never said a word. That was not part of the discussion. They understood on the R side, the speaker did, that there were just some things that were going to be happening. And he made those decisions. But it was because we decided to come over that he was willing to make those decisions. And since that time, to my knowledge, power cost equalization has always been fully funded. There's not been a question. And so there was some good things. And, the politics, statewide politics in the legislature, the success or failure of anybody is whether or not they're willing to develop relationships with people on the other side of the aisle. And I came down with a chip on my shoulder, I think, and quickly learned that somebody that was your adversary on one issue one day is somebody you might meet on a different issue the next day. And some of the people that I would debate have the most rigorously with are the ones that I credit for making me work the hardest. Because I had to anticipate their arguments, had to be ready for them. I had to be ready for how they were going to come after me on my position on certain things. And that made me feel like I could stand up and debate with anybody. And because within our own caucus, we didn't have those differences. So we never had to have those debates. So I got to know them better, some of the Republicans better than I did the Democrats. And even though we had these huge differences of opinions on things like right to life or subsistence, those disagreements were about issues and not personal. And so there was a level of decorum that we had, and we could break bread after those heated debates.
I'll ask a question about that because I have found that I enjoy vigorous debate. I think I enjoy it more than some of my colleagues. I don't hold a grudge after a vigorous debate, but I found that some of them do. And there's a couple of people that it's very difficult to disagree with them because they take it personally.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I was pretty thin-skinned initially. I think that was a description of me. But you learn to toughen up because you're not going to win everything. But you also, in disagreeing with somebody, you can do it in a way that's respectful and not personal. The right to life issues, holy cows, those are very difficult issues. And at my core, I think I tend to be pro-life. But I would remind those who took the pro-life position that I'm also pro-life after birth, that you'll be there for the child if necessary after they're born, not just so that they could be born. And oftentimes that was the parting place. And that's where some of the people that I had these disagreements, we found a place that we could work because they maintained the integrity of their position and I maintained the integrity of mine. We found that skinny place where we could try and accommodate each other because there is space there.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, to mention the word tribe in this building was difficult. And now look at it. So I think the body in some ways has come a long way on some issues. But the issues with few minor things are still the same. For a long time, we didn't want to talk about climate change, so we talk about changing weather, whatever makes the world work. It was a good time here. It was tough to see, though. Sometimes you run into an individual or individuals who would begin to wear their title like it was a crown.
Mm-hmm.
And generally speaking, they don't last too long down here. And one of the things that I learned from Al, who was one of the masters of, I think, the political world and the maneuvering, he was a public servant first. And so I always bristled when somebody called me a politician, because I always felt like I was a public servant first, and I could be a politician if it became necessary.
You had a heart attack while you were serving.
I did.
What happened?
2003. I woke up at 6 minutes after 4 o'clock in the morning, staying up on Star Hill. I couldn't breathe and hurt like hell. And I was in a state of panic because I was all by myself.
And it was during session?
That was during session. And so the mind is a funny thing. Because after the initial shock, because I didn't know what the hell was going on. At that point, I had no clue what was going on. But I knew there was two issues. One was the immense pain, and the other was I couldn't breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And the mind sorts out things really fast. Mine concentrated on oxygen. And at some point when I made that decision, the pain didn't exist anymore, because I was so focused on
Breathing.
And when I was in high school, we would, especially on the cross-country runs, you would be just tired.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing left in your gas tank.
Mm-hmm.
And the coach would say, spread your diaphragm.
Yep.
Get oxygen. Get air back into your body. And that's what I remembered. And that's what I did until I could think. And after I settled down, I called the emergency room at the hospital, Bartlett.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, the day before, I had this incredible ache in my arms. And I went to urgent care and diagnosed me with acid reflux.
Oh, they made a big mistake.
They did, but a lot of the symptoms are the same.
Yeah, I know, but...
And anyway, I described to the lady who answered the phone of what I had gone in for. And she said, you can go to a drugstore and you can get something, or you can come here and we'll help you. That's what I focused on.
Right.
Was that offered hand of help.
Mm-hmm.
And my truck was parked at the bottom of Star Hill. And this is when there's no explanation other than what just happened, right? When she said, you can come in and we'll help, it's like the overlay of the map to the road just settled in my brain. So I knew it was okay to drive. So I got dressed. I walked down the bottom of the hill, stumbled into my truck, drove myself to the hospital, and then they medevac me up to Anchorage.
Wow. It's a miracle.
And Dr. Rainier, George Rainier, was my cardiologist. He told me that there was a series of aneurysms on one of my arteries, and they could put in a stent, but those aneurysms would still be there.
Right.
I said, how do you get around that? He said, you do a bypass. Let's go for it. So we did. And so I went in, and I don't know, probably took 3.5 hours to do that. Came out of it.
They broke your chest open and...
Oh, yeah. I got the zipper. And I was in recovery, and the nurse called the operating doctor, Steve Jones, and Dr. Valdez back in and said he still has internal bleeding. So they wheeled me back into the operating room, took out the staples they just put in. And for 11 hours, they tried to keep blood in my heart.
Oh, my God.
So that turned out to be a very long day.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, I don't remember any of it. As it turned out, my wife kept a logbook, and it was probably 10 days after all of that, maybe 2 weeks even, when I was reading her notes, came upon this page that said I had transfusion. I said, oh, shit. She said, what? They gave me a transfusion. Yeah, they had to keep you alive. I said, that's not my issue. I said, my question is, if they gave me some other blood, do I have any native blood left in me? And at that point, she knew I was on my way to recovery. I had my sense of humor back.
So what part of session did that happen in? And how much did
that
you miss?
happen on May 3rd? So it was
The end. See, it's the
right,
end.
close to the end of session.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that was quite an experience.
And you said that was 2003. So it was not an election year. So you could recover, come back the next session.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it was May 7th. I'd have to ask Mary Feltola that when her son was born. I think he was born on May 6th. Because when I went in, the next day she was in the hospital, she had a baby. And I told the doctor, if you're going to admit me, I want to be Mary's roommate so I can see her son.
That's funny.
But Eric Croft ended up in the hospital at the same time because he had what the hell is that called? Hernia.
Okay.
A ruptured hernia.
A ruptured hernia.
Yeah. And those things are messy.
Yeah.
He was actually more shaped than I was because you got to clean that up.
So that's
really
three Democrats that were all in the hospital at the same
well.
time.
Close to the same time.
Yeah. So that, I guess y'all were all in the minority.
Yep.
So I guess it doesn't really matter.
Nope. Yeah, it was an interesting time. It really was. Made it through it.
Yeah. And then after you left, you were the Northwest Arctic Borough Mayor.
Mhm.
What was that experience like?
Probably the best way to put this. It's almost like your governor, but your mayor, and the assembly is your legislative body. And you have a budget, and you have a code, and you have to learn about both and become very adept. And you had to learn about your assembly and how they were, for lack of a better way of saying it. And where were the things that you could work on? And then you had to decide if there was going to be a disagreement, which ones of those disagreements were important to win, and which ones were not as important.
President Obama appointed you to the president's tribal leaders task force on climate preparedness.
And resilience,
Mhm.
climate change and resilience. Yes, he did.
Was that an interesting experience?
Oh, it was crazy. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I guess I can't even remember when that was, but you had to back up a little bit. 2006.
Mm-hmm.
As a person in a minority, I was able to put together a resolution that created, or House Joint Resolution, I guess, that created a, what do we call it? As a climate change commission or something along
Something like
those
that.
lines. and it got it through the legislature.
And Palin was governor. She's
No, who in the hell was governor? No,
Murkowski.
maybe Murkowski. I was worried about what that would mean to our renewable resources, the fish, the game, migration, all of that. And as a result, what it would mean to the people who I represented. And so one day, it was a Tuesday, I was down at the bar, drinking my alcoholic beer, thinking things through. And there was only one other person that day. And it happened to be, I guess by that time, maybe it was ConocoPhillips employee who was down here. And he came up and introduced himself and said, "How serious are you about this climate change task commission or whatever?" And I said, "Oh, I'm pretty serious." And I told him why. And I looked at him and I said, "You're with oil companies, and here's why you should be concerned. You build sea levels. Permafrost is melting. All of your investments are sitting and built on top of the permafrost. Your exploration time is this window. What happens if that window was shortened?" I said, "There's a whole bunch of reasons that the industry needs to be on board with all of this. I have my reason as a rural person and as a business person." He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Absolutely." And so it became one of those partnerships where he worked the R's and I worked the D's, and I did whatever needed to. And we got it through the House. Lyda Green was a co-chair of the operating budget.
Lyda Green was a longtime senator for the Mat-Su.
She came up to me in about 3 weeks to the end of the session. She said, "That stupid little bill that you have on climate stuff," she said, "that's not going anywhere." I said, "Okay, I understand it. I hope you keep yourself open." Yes. And Mike did his thing.
Chanel. No, sorry.
Michael Hurley.
Got it.
And he quietly went around. And it was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 days to the end of the session. Lyda Green came up to me. She said, "I have never seen the alliance that I'm seeing on your stupid little bill. I'm going to hear it. It's in the budget. When I hear it, please don't even come to the table. I'd prefer you weren't even in the room." And I said, "Yes, ma'am."
Wow. You didn't come to the table?
Nope.
Your staff presented it?
I'm sorry?
Did your staff present it, or how did it get presented?
Actually, I think Donnie did.
Interesting.
I know he had to do it on the floor.
Yeah.
But I and maybe my staff was there, that she, as a chair of the operating budget, she got to make the rules. It had its hearing, but she asked me not to be. So I was. And it got through. And then Ralph Samuels ended up being the chair of that group. And Michael Hurley, I made sure got pointed to it. And there were several others. And it went real well for a while. And then we got hung up on air quality stuff, emissions. And you know how that can get bogged down. So that's where it lost its momentum. Then later on, we came up with the Northern Waters Task Force in 2009, and we started attacking some of those things from a coastal perspective. And came up with some recommendations. And I was involved in some of that stuff already. Then when I went up and after I was left the legislature and became the borough mayor, the climate issues were still something I was focused on, and then got tapped by the president to sit on that actual task force. And there were 26 or 27 of us. And they were governors, mayors of big cities, small towns, commissioners, county commissioners. And there were 2 indigenous people, one from Wisconsin, and myself from Alaska. She and I worked really good together. And then the president decided to come to Alaska.
And so did you help show him around?
Actually, he came up to Kotzebue.
Really?
Yep. And I had found out, it's very quietly told that he was going to be going up. He was trying to consider where else to go. And I said, when he came out with the stimulus funds, the seawall in Kotzebue got built with those stimulus funds. We were one of the first $40 million worth. And that's because it was a shovel-ready project. I said, and that's an example of a community becoming better prepared as climate change. And of course, it latched onto that. It was those stimulus dollars that made it possible. So he got a chance to go up there and see that at work. Kivalina was the front page community that was being impacted by the storms and the rising. And there was a lot of questions about going to Kivalina and all of that. And finally, she called from Air Force One and said, we're going to fly over Kivalina. I told them what to look for, what they were seeing. I wasn't there, but I went to Kivalina 100 times. Then they came into Kotzebue. He did his thing. That was pretty cool.
That's very cool.
But when I had to keep it under wraps for months, and when I was finally able to let the community know, and we had to tell them because Secret Service started coming around.
Mm-hmm.
That community just came together, and people just started doing different things. People stepped up to the plate. And I'd already met the president as a member of that task force when they were looking at who was going to be with the president in different places. I said, I've already met him. I said, I want somebody else to have that honor and that opportunity. So I stepped back, even as a borough mayor. I said, no, I'm good. I'm good. And
that's so selfless. In general, a mayor would think, I've got to be there. I'm the mayor.
Well, I ended up having to be there because of protocol. But I did it under a condition. I said, I'll only be there if you will not go back on the person that you were having take my place.
So you both got to be there.
Yep. And otherwise, I was just going to not be there. And they were willing to do that. So that was good. And we got to ride with him to the function in his bulletproof car and all of that. And it was
so fun. I was going to go into climate change in this building and maybe climate change in Alaska in general, talking about it as a political topic. I don't know if people are just exhausted by talking about climate change, or they don't talk about climate change, or I just feel like it in some ways is not talked about as much as I think it should be.
I guess maybe the larger question is, are we adapting to the changes that are occurring is really the important part of that discussion. And because in some cases we're moving communities, right? And we're involved in that. We're doing lousy on major maintenance stuff, mostly because we don't have the money. You look at what's happening with fishing, and I think there's a lot of room of improvement. You look at the changing numbers of caribou or moose in certain areas and other things that seem to be happening. And when I heard of people getting all upset at the Department of Fish and Game for allowing for 100 bears to be taken, I think from the Mulchatna area interior, maybe it was Game Unit 13. I thought, do that in 23, the Game Unit, because the bears were they're having their way with the caribou and fawning and moose and sheep, both the wolves and the bears. They're way too many. And do it in our place. And so I think on both sides, we're not doing what we should be, in my opinion. And we're too sensitive about
We're not talking about it.
Yeah.
If we're not doing it, And we're not talking about it. And I think that some of that belongs to the minority. Why aren't we bringing it up more? Why aren't we talking about it more? I wouldn't expect the majority to, just the way politics works, the particular House majority to be moving on solving climate change issues, but we're not really even talking about it.
Yeah. I think it's like the education issue, right? The role of the minority is to minority.
Right.
And sometimes we take those a little too seriously. And the reason I say that is based on what has happened, especially in education, and how that has panned out. I see it as the role of the majority and the governor, majority in the House and the governor, to put up something with people. They're the ones that chose to, one, veto,
And not
and two,
override.
sustain it.
Yep.
So now the weight of that world is on them. Let them fix it. Because if they don't, will people suffer? You're damn right they will. But will there be consequences? Oh, yes. And so I think between the governor and the majority on the House side, they need to come up with a plan to do something. Otherwise, education could really bite them, given that this is an election year.
Mm-hmm.
And for once, the minority should get out of the way.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Don't try to save everybody all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, if the herd's going to go over the cliff, maybe that's what needs to happen. And I was in the minority, and we had to save the world. It was, for some reason, the whole weight of that was on our shoulders. And then, when you're in the majority, you're doing the same thing, but in a different way, in a way that made sense to you. And I think sometimes we have these debates, these disagreements, and really, if the Democrats were in the majority, you'd probably be spending about the same amount of money as the majority is today. You would just be spending it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And not that much difference. To me, the way I think about education, because of my dad being an educator, because I had the opportunity to go to a really good school, even though it was a small school, and I fast forward to 2024, and I recognize that it's changed. And there's a piece of me that says, it's not the school's responsibility to save a child. It's the school's responsibility to educate a child. It's the parents and the community's responsibility to raise the children in such a way that they are informed, engaged, and ready to go. And that some things you have to do, you have to accept the responsibility for doing. Because no school can be a parent. So if we lay this heavy thing, an expectation on the school, and then don't give them the resources to do it, the only way we're going to get out of that dilemma is to have parents and communities step up to the plate and accept those responsibilities. And that's not a Democratic thing. That's not a Republican thing. That's a human nature thing. And for too long, we expect somebody else to step up to the plate in our failings, and we've gotten lenient. What happened to expecting your child to do the homework or do their chores or earn their allowance or whatever? And because I think life has gotten easy, it's not a struggle anymore. We don't know what useful things they could do. And so parenting means something totally different today than it did in another era. We turn on the TV or we give them a Game Boy. So be quiet.
And ironically, I think it makes kids more unhappy. I think being useful, being of service, having a purpose makes people and children happy.
It gives them more than happy. It gives them value.
It gives them value. Having your child just sit in front of a TV for 5 hours after school because that keeps them quiet and out of your hair, that doesn't, they're quiet, but there's no reason for being.
It used to be with boys as they were transitioning into adolescence and then transitioning into being young men, had this great amount of testosterone that you'd go outside and fight, get it over with. Now we give them Ritalin to calm them down. And we have a fix for everything, and we're perfectly capable of fixing ourselves. That map that downloaded into my brain, I didn't think I was going to be okay. It was just, and there was that higher power that knew I had to face. And that if I were to receive that downloading, I would recognize it for what it was. Since then, I've had cancer. And that's why I wear this thing, because I have no nose. Right?
When did that happen?
When?
Yeah.
Last summer.
Last summer.
And when we gather our children together, I said, this is how this is going to work. I have cancer. And they're going to have to take off my nose, and we'll see where it goes from there. But I refuse to have a bad day. So don't you come crying to me, because I'm not going to be there for you. You tell your best friend. And if you're going to have a bad day over my condition, go have it over there. Do not bring your bad day to me. I refuse to have one. I had one good day, and all the other days were better than that since I found out the news. I had one good day. Every other day was better than that. My kids knew it. My grandkids knew it. And if you don't think you can make yourself better, then you don't have any faith. If you don't have any faith in yourself and your state of mind, what are we doing? And I know I'm not that strong of a person, because I know me better than anybody else knows me. I ain't that strong of a person. It's an adjustment that we make here in our minds. There's a lot of things you can be successful when you recognize that your mind, your body's like an army, but your mind's the general. Now, we're not always going to be successful, right? But what is success? That you face the enemy and lost, or that you ran away from it? And it's important for me to let my children and grandchildren know that there's more to be strong than a top-notch physique. That you can control any level of strength with your brain, and you won't always be successful. And I had my CAT scan a little over a week ago. There's no cancer. It's all gone. Now I gotta think about getting a new nose. And the only thing I wonder about that is, should I just get I had my other nose was broken 5 times. Should I just get a straight version of the same thing? Or do I look at Jimmy Durante and say, I want one of those? Or
And when do you think you'll get a new nose?
I'm thinking this fall. My family, when I was going through radiation and all that, with all of the stuff, it's not like you can just blow your nose and clean it out and
Right.
get it picked until it's oblate. And all of my kids worked through all of that. And I guess the bottom line is they were there.
Yeah.
every step of the way. My wife was never alone, and neither was
They
I.
helped you. It's not something anybody expects in life to lose their nose. No one's prepared for that.
No.
I'm
And it's nobody expects to have breast cancer
Right.
or anything. It was minor, so that was lucky. I don't know how minor losing your nose is, but compared to other things, that's pretty minor.
Yeah. But how did you know? I mean,
My wife and I had COVID. And then after that, it seemed like I had a sore and a scab inside. And so every day I would ingest water into my nose and blow it out, warm water,
right.
loosen it up, blow it out. And I did that. Then one day after about a year, it smelled different. I went right to the hospital. And
Like it smelled bad.
it smelled like it was infected or rotten. It was just a different smell.
Yeah.
Before there was no smell.
So you went to the doctor.
And they said, here. It was here. And they referred me to Anchorage. They said they did a biopsy and said I was precancerous. Got up there, it was full blown. Had 4 operations, and the last 2 were removal.
Of the whole nose.
The third one was removal of the nose, and then the fourth one was removing the last bit of cancer, and there was nothing in the margin. Yeah.
I'm so thankful that your most recent CAT scan was cancer-free.
Yeah, me too.
So grateful for you being on today. And I'm so sorry we went so far over time, but it's good stuff. I'm so grateful.
To serve in this kind of an elected office is an incredible privilege, but even more of a responsibility. And the best thing anybody can do here is try to, I used to see my role as being from rural Alaska, to be a bridge builder between urban and rural, and the bridge was a bridge of understanding. That Kotzebue was a bedroom community of Anchorage. And we all wanted the same things, just different. And we should learn about what those differences are and celebrate them.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Glad to be here.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call the office at 907-465-4940.